Most people know of witches from the movies. Horror films with evil, crackling old women dressed in black, mixing potions and lotions, and bringing doom to their victims. The truth is, in fact, as normal, far from the Hollywood version. Most of this false reality comes from religious intolerance over the centuries. Church propaganda spread stories and fear among the masses. This in turn brought down violence upon those practicing witchcraft. So, what is the real truth? Did witches deal with the devil? Did they eat their victims? Did they mix their special brews in big black cauldrons? It's time to find out. Witchcraft is traditionally the exercise of invocation or supernatural powers to control people or events. These practices normally involve sorcery or magic. There is no way of defining witches because they differ throughout the world. From Europe to Africa and beyond, tales of witchcraft vary. In the West, witches are normally depicted as ugly old women meeting secretly at night. They indulged in sexual orgies and cannibalism. Satan or the devil are normally involved. This is all imagination. Stories created and fostered by a fearful Christianity attempting to wipe out the old pagan ways. So powerful were these tales that ordinary men and women were hunted down and slaughtered for hundreds of years. The modern English word witchcraft has three principal connotations. These are the practices of magic or sorcery, the beliefs associated with the Western witch hunts of the 14th to 18th centuries, and varieties of the modern movement called Wicca. The words witchcraft and witch are in fact derived from Old English Wicca craft. Basically, it means the craft of those practicing magic or sorcery. There are many names for witches across the world, and they are all very different, with different meanings. We shall focus on the more European and Western versions. Some societies regard a witch as a person with inherent supernatural powers. But in the West, witchcraft has been more commonly believed to be an ordinary person's free choice to learn and practice magic with the help of the supernatural. The history of witches is also problematic because it has been bent and twisted by writers for centuries. For instance, even today there are some writers who insist that the infamous witch hunts occurred in the Middle Ages. This is not true. They in fact started in the 14th century, what historians call early modern. This was the era of Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution, and yet there wasn't a very enlightened and accepting culture. It is also stated that witches are part of some cult or organization. These cults worshipped a horned god or goddess. This is not true either. Witches were not members of any formal pagan religion. There was no pagan headquarters. Neither were they just healers or midwives, as some reports would have us believe. Neither were all witches women. There were a great many male witches. They were also not always old. Witches were of many ages, and so, if there were no old hag witches practicing devil worship, then there were no witch hunts as such. Those hunted down and killed were simply pagans. That is, they followed an ancient belief system of the earth. They understood how to use root crops, monitor seasons, and much more. They were in fact a persecuted minority in a Christian world that wanted to wipe out all those who opposed its beliefs. Neither did the witch hunts prosecute, let alone execute millions. Was there really some grand conspiracy by males, priests, judges, doctors, or inquisitors against members of an old religion or any other real group? One of the accusations against witches is that they practiced black masses, but these are almost entirely the fantasy of modern writers. In the West, there were no witch doctors whose job it was to release people from evil spells. So what were they doing? A sorcerer, magician, or witch attempted to influence the surrounding world through occult means. The occult is simply something hidden and therefore not seen by outsiders. In fact, in the West, until the 14th century, witchcraft had more in common with the practice of sorcery in other cultures, such as those of India or Africa, than it did with the witchcraft of the witch hunts. It was simply those methods practiced by witches of achieving personal goals, not plotting against those people around them. In short, like their counterparts worldwide, early Western sorcerers and witches worked secretly for private ends, as contrasted with the public practice of religion. Their worship was therefore not controlled by a greater church, and so it was a threat to the establishing Christianity. Establishments in all ages will attempt to vilify small groups opposed to it. Methods used by witches included incantations using formulas or chants invoking spirits, divination, and oracles to predict the future, amulets and charms to ward off hostile spirits and harmful events, potions or salves, and dolls of other figures to represent their enemies. Their aims were to preserve good health, to acquire property, to protect themselves from others, from natural disasters or what they called evil spirits, to help friends and family, and occasionally to seek revenge. These aims were as old as man, and today little has changed. What has changed are the methods. For thousands of years, things such as animal sacrifice to maintain fertility were used. It is even in the Old Testament. Increase the slaughter, and you increase the fertility. The mixing of tales of sorcerers and witchcraft saw over time them both being believed to be the same thing. Because sorcery called upon the work of spirits and gods, so too eventually did witchcraft in the popular culture. In Africa, the same idea persists between sorcery and witchcraft. Here, just as in Europe, witches are still seen as particularly active after dusk, when law-abiding mortals are asleep. According to traditional Navajo belief, when a witch travels at night, he wears the skin of a dead animal in order to effect a transformation into that animal. These are known as skinwalkers, and they hold nighttime meetings at which they wear nothing except a mask, sitting among baskets of corpses, and have intercourse with dead women. In some African cultures, witches are believed to assemble in cannibal covens, often at graveyards or around a fire, to feast on the blood that they, like vampires, extract from their victims. If they take the soul of a victim's body and keep it in their possession, the victim will die. Like those in Western societies suspected of child abuse and Satanism, African witches in the popular imagination are believed to practice incest and other perversions. The power of witches is often believed to come from a special pact they have through animal familiars. They are assistants or agents in the magical realm, and they are often cats, dogs, and owls. Often, the power is thought to come from within the witch themselves without the need for external aid. Among the Zande of the Congo and some other Central African peoples, the source of this evil working capacity is believed to be located in the witch's stomach, and its power and range increase with age. The magical power can be activated simply by wishing it. At the same time, the Zande believe the evil deeds can be wrought even more effectively by the manipulation of spells and potions and the use of powerful magic. In fact, this is technically sorcery, and like the witches in Shakespeare's play Macbeth, who dance around a pot stirring potions and muttering spells, the Zande practitioners may more properly be termed sorcerers rather than witches. In many African cultures, witches are believed to act unconsciously, unaware of the ill they cause, and are driven by irrepressible urges to act badly. It is therefore easy for those accused of witchcraft, but who are not conscious of wishing anyone ill, to assume that they unknowingly did what was attributed to them. You simply assume you are guilty, even though you had no intention of doing harm. In this way, many so-called witches become scapegoats. This, along with the effects of suggestion and torture in a world where people take the reality of witchcraft for granted, goes far to explain the striking confessions of guilt that are so widely reported in Africa and elsewhere, and that are otherwise hard to comprehend. Over time, witches and sorcerers have been accused of all manner of disease and disaster. Sickness, death, loss of fortune, and more have been and still are regularly placed at the witch's door. In both Africa and Asia, natural disasters and epidemics have been blamed on witchcraft. In fact, many people in third world countries who fail exams, lose elections, or can't find a job are accused of witchcraft. It seems to be the go-to place to explain away ordinary ups and downs of life. All the more need to teach science and logic. The problem often occurs when we ask the question, why? Why did my crops fail? Why is my wife unwell? Why cannot I give birth? To have a simple and relatively mystical answer is a route out of the unknown. And so, the same area blame is aimed is also the same area resolution is sought. We go to witches and sorcerers for a cure. When your very existence relies upon the yield of the field, you will try anything to ensure a good harvest. Because witches are blamed for bad harvest, they become evil in the mindset of some. Because they give a better harvest to the farmer down the road, they are evil. Eventually, evil piles up on the poor witch. The witch, therefore, becomes someone who selfishly wants more than he or she ostensibly deserves, whose aspirations and desires are judged excessive and illegitimate. However, there is a narrow, ambiguous line between good and evil. Among some African peoples, witchcraft is intrinsically neither morally good nor bad. And among others, The supernatural activities of witches are, according to their perceived effects, divided into good or protective and bad or destructive witchcraft. Some modern African leaders surround themselves with protective witch doctors and are themselves thought to be endowed with supernatural power. This is the positive charisma of which witchcraft is the negative counterpart. In the colonial period, these ideas were extended to Europeans who, in the Belgian Congo and British Central Africa at the time of independence, were thought to be cannibalistic witches. This was somewhat ironic, since colonial regimes, unlike missionary predecessors, did not believe in witchcraft and made accusations of witchcraft illegal in most of sub-Saharan Africa. This ambiguity between good and evil can also be found among the Mapuche, an indigenous people of Chile. They believe that young women take up sorcery, and as old women become powerful witches who use bad medicine to obtain their ends. They are aligned with evil forces and use them to harm or gain advantage over others. Their training and use of plants and animals in their medicine is similar to that of shamans, who use good medicine and other magic against forces of evil. In Haitian Vodou, there is a sharp distinction between man-made evil magic powers connected with zombies and the good invisible spirits identified with Catholic saints. This evil and good concept is an extension of what occurred in Europe. New Christianity was good, old paganism was bad. And so the comparisons we make in our modern times now are similar. Science is the good, religion and paganism are the old bad ways. What will it be in the future? Will the Pope be accused of being a witch dealing with the devil? Many believe that European witchcraft really emerged from what is known as Wicca. Wicca is also known as pagan witchcraft and is in fact a modern pagan religion. It developed in the early 20th century and introduced to the population by an ex-civil servant called Gerald Gardner. Secret teachings and books were used to spread the new religion, claiming all the time that it was in fact a continuation of a long line of esoteric belief. In fact, the term Wicca may be old, but the modern practice, although based loosely upon historic research, is nothing more than a created religion. To get to the origin of witchcraft is not as easy as we might think. Most people think that witches are a Christian invention, but the idea of the witch who flies in the night and draws power from the dark cosmic forces to work her ill will on others predates Christianity probably by many centuries. In Homer's Odyssey, the character Circe, who turns men into animals, is described as a witch, and Plutarch refers to witchcraft in his treatise on superstition. Illicit magic features heavily in Roman law statutes, some of which are passed down to the Christian world. However, many of these early laws were really laws against sorcery, which, unlike witchcraft, can be beneficial, and which requires special skills, tools, and words. Archaeologists have found hundreds of ancient Greek curse tablets, which the Greeks called kataras, meaning curses that bind tight, and they appear to have invented them with a great number focused on sporting competitions or legal contests. The inscribed tablets were left in graves, wells, or fountains, where the dead could better work their magic. In later centuries, constant attempts to defeat heresy brought to light a number of figures who were difficult to reconcile with Christianity. Such figures were typically created without reference to witchcraft at all, but led to the creation of the figure of the heretic witch. One such feature was particular to the Western Alps. She was the female embodiment of winter, a female figure often called Bertha. She punished social disobedience and rewarded goodness. She was always portrayed as an old hag because she represented cold and winter. It did not take long for intellectuals to note her resemblance to the witches with whom they were familiar from classical literature. Slowly, and in bits and pieces, the idea of the witch emerged. The witch is a person who employs magical entities, which may include powers she carries within her body to harm other people. She doesn't have to be a female. She certainly doesn't have to have a hat and a broomstick. She has to be like the dead, hard and infertile, and she has to hate. The dead hate the living, and the witch hates just as they do. There is no particular moment when this popular idea is formulated. The witch's familiar was usually a small animal, sometimes as tiny as a housefly. The witch fed the familiar, and in return it may act out her commands. It was, in fact, a kind of fairy known as the household brownie or hob. These creatures favored cream and had to be appeased by constant offerings of it, or they could start to behave like poltergeists. It was therefore assumed that they could be put to work ruining the work of other householders. Familiars may also be related to the Norse fylgja or fetch, a person's double, which can also shapeshift to animal form. The fylgja is associated with a person's luck or fortune. To the learned, in the 17th century, however, the familiar was simply a devil. Familiars are mentioned in the 1566 Chelmsford witchcraft trial, where the familiar in question resembles a human being. The idea that you can separate out part of yourself, a part that may look exactly like you, and send it to work your will on the bodies of others is central to the idea of witchcraft. The 11th century saw the arrival of the scholar. Scholastic philosophy meant that all of created nature became an object of scrutiny from which scholars could create a model that applied to everything. Soon, aspects of folklore that had been smiled away or incorporated into Christian worship in earlier periods were looked at again. Large monasteries over the 12th to 14th centuries became preoccupied with the moral problem of wet dreams. Was it sinful to have a wet dream? Monks reported that their nocturnal emissions were often the results of being pressed or sat on by a humid female figure. Since no women were allowed into monastic dormitories, somebody suggested that the female figures might be devils capable of transforming themselves into the appearance of females in order to tempt monks into sexual sin. Further leaps of logic concluded that demons wanted to produce offspring, so they haunted monastic dormitories to steal human seed in order to impregnate women with demon children. This is when the Roman idea of the witch and her manifestation as the embodiment of winter in alpine regions catastrophically came together to allow the first generation of witch experts to formulate an exact identity for the recipients of the seed. She was old, outcast, ugly, and eccentric. She became the witch we know today. By the 1590s, the last decade of Elizabeth I's reign, the idea of the witch in England had taken root as an old, very poor woman, lame or blind in one eye, and inclined to lose her temper over personal slights. Her dry, twisted, and aging body was a kind of poison, and she was believed to be able to harm people and animals simply by speaking to them or looking at them. In the meantime, the law had been updated to reflect the work of continental witch experts. These so-called thinkers rejected the idea that elderly women could do magic that flouted the will of God. They concluded it must be the devil who had all the power, and so the witch's familiar became demonic. Soon witches were being accused of evil, and trials began. As an accused witch, you could be tried in a church court, at local courts, or at an assize court, where you could be condemned to death. The process, however, was similar at every level. Somebody would complain to the local justice of the peace that you had bewitched an animal or a foodstuff or a child. Whether or not the complaint is taken any further depends on how energetic the justice of peace was and how much he believed in witchcraft. At the trial, those who submitted written complaints took the stand and gave their evidence aloud and under oath. The witch would also take the stand, and the confession would be read aloud. After that, the jury would decide on your guilt. There was no counsel for the defense. If the witch was found guilty, he became one of the estimated 50,000 people who were executed for witchcraft in the early modern era. Witchcraft caused great fear within society, but it also often became a function of normal life. Somebody new to a community might be accused of witchcraft because his or her neighbors were suspicious of them. Sometimes a person might pretend to be bewitched because it was a way of making money. People were more suspicious of witchcraft when the harvest failed, as they looked to find a cause. Witchcraft trials became ways for grievances and disputes to be aired, and for people to stand in testimony for or against their neighbors. In many ways, understanding the history of witchcraft tells us less about the supernatural than it does about the realities that desires within mankind itself. The trials endured by witches were horrific. As part of the infamous swimming test, accused witches were dragged into the nearest body of water, stripped to their undergarments, bound, and then tossed in to see if they would sink or float. Since witches were believed to have spurned the sacrament of baptism, it was thought that the water would reject their body and prevent them from submerging. According to this logic, an innocent person would sink like a stone, but a witch would simply bob on the surface. The victim typically had a rope tied around their waist so they could be pulled from the water if they sank. But it wasn't unusual for accidental drowning deaths to occur. Witch swimming derived from the trial by water. an ancient practice where suspected criminals and sorcerers were thrown into rushing rivers to allow a higher power to decide their fate. This custom was banned in many European countries in the Middle Ages, only to re-emerge in the 17th century as a witch experiment. Medieval wisdom also held that witches were incapable of speaking scripture aloud, so accused sorcerers were made to recite selections from the Bible, usually the Lord's Prayer, without making mistakes or omissions. While it may have simply been a sign that the suspected witch was illiterate or nervous, any errors were viewed as proof that the speaker was in league with the devil. This twisted test of public speaking ability was commonly used as hard evidence in witch trials. Still, even a successful prayer test didn't guarantee an acquittal. During the Salem witch trials, the accused sorcerer George Burroughs flawlessly recited the prayer from the gallows just before his execution. The performance was dismissed as a devil's trick. The hanging proceeded as planned. The touch test worked on the idea that victims of sorcery would have a special reaction to physical contact with their evildoer. In cases where a possessed person fell into spells or fits, the suspected witch would be brought into the room and asked to lay a hand on them. A non-reaction signaled innocence. But if the victim came out of their fit, it was seen as proof that the suspect had placed them under a spell. Touch tests played a famous part in the 1662 trial of Rose Cullender and Amy Denny, two elderly English women charged with bewitching a pair of young girls. The children had been suffered from their fits that left their fists clenched so tightly that even a strong man could not pry their fingers apart. But early tests showed they easily opened whenever Cullender or Denny touched them. To ensure the reaction was genuine, judges had the children blindfolded and touched by other members of the court. The girls unclenched their fists anyway, which suggested they were faking. But even this was not enough to prove the women's innocence. Cullender and Denny were both later hanged as witches. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish which witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. This devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. Prosecutors might also search for the witch's teat, an extra nipple allegedly used to suckle the witch's helper animals. In both cases, it was easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, supernunnery nipples, and tattoos could all qualify. So examiners rarely came up empty-handed. In the midst of witch hunts, desperate villagers would sometimes even burn or cut off any offending marks on their bodies, only to have their wounds labeled as proof of the covenant with the devil. Most supposed witches were usually old women and invariably poor. Any who were unfortunate enough to be crone-like, snaggle-toothed, sunken-cheeked, and having a hairy lip were assumed to possess the evil eye. If they also had a cat, this was taken as proof, as witches always had a familiar, the cat being the most common. Many unfortunate women were condemned on this sort of evidence and hanged after undergoing appalling torture. The thumbscrews and leg irons heated over a brazier usually got a confession from the supposed witch. Witch fever gripped East Anglia for 14 terrible months between 1645 and 1646. The people of these eastern countries were solidly Puritan and rabid anti-Catholics and easily swayed by bigoted preachers whose mission was to seek out the slightest whiff of heresy. A man called Matthew Hopkins, an unsuccessful lawyer, came to help. He became known as the Witch-Finder General and had 68 people put to death in Bury St. Edmunds alone, and 19 hanged at Chelmsford in a single day. After Chelmsford, he set off to Norfolk and Suffolk. He was paid £6 for clearing the town of witches. In King's Lynn, he got £15, and a grateful Stowmarket gave him £23. This was at a time when the daily wage was 2.5 pence. It was good money being a witch finder. Much of Matthew Hopkins' theories of deduction were based on devil's marks. A wart or mole or even a flea bite he took to be a devil's mark, and he used his jabbing needle to see if these marks were insensitive to pain. While the idea of witchcraft began to mingle with the persecution of heretics even in the 14th century, the beginning of the witch hunts as a phenomenon in its own right became apparent during the first half of the 15th century in southeastern France and western Switzerland, in communities of the Western Alps, in what was at the time Burgundy and Savoy. Here the cause of eliminating the supposed satanic witches from society was taken up by a number of individuals. Claude Tolleson, for instance, had tried over 200 people, accusing them of witchcraft in Briançon, Dauphine, by 1420. While early trials fall still within the late medieval period, the peak of the witch hunt was during the period of the European Wars of Religion, between about 1580 and 1630. Over the entire duration of the phenomenon of some 3 centuries, an estimated total of 40,000 to 100,000 people were executed. The height of the European witch trials was between 1560 and 1630, with the large hunts first beginning in 1609. The witch trials of Trier in Germany was perhaps the biggest witch trial in European history. The persecution started in the Diocese of Trier in 1581 and reached the city itself in 1587, where they were led to the deaths of about 368 people, and as such, it was perhaps the biggest mass execution in Europe during peacetime. In Denmark, the burning of witches increased following the Reformation of 1536. Christian IV of Denmark, in particular, encouraged this practice, and hundreds of people were convicted of witchcraft and burned. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1542 regulated the penalties for witchcraft. In the North Berwick witch trials in Scotland, over 70 people were accused of witchcraft on account of bad weather. The sentence for an individual found guilty of witchcraft or sorcery during this time and in previous centuries typically included either burning at the stake or being tested with the ordeal of cold water. While the witch trials had begun to fade out across much of Europe by the mid-17th century, they continued to a greater extent on the fringes of Europe and in the American colonies. The clergy and intellectuals began to speak out against the trials from the late 16th century. Johannes Kepler in 1615 could only by the weight of his prestige keep his mother from being burned as a witch. The 1692 Salem witch trials were a brief outburst of witch hysteria in the New World at a time when the practice was already waning in Europe. In January of 1692, the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Parris of Salem Village became ill. William Griggs, the village doctor, was called in when they failed to improve. His diagnosis of bewitchment put into motion the forces that would ultimately result in the hanging deaths of 19 men and women. In addition, one man was pressed to death, several others died in prison, and the lives of many were irrevocably changed. To understand the events of the Salem witch trials, it is necessary to examine the times in which accusations of witchcraft occurred. There were the ordinary stresses of the 17th century life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a strong belief in the devil, factions among Salem Village families, and rivalry with nearby Salem town, combined with the recent smallpox epidemic and the threat of attack by warring tribes, created a fertile ground for fear and suspicion. Soon, prisons were filled with more than 150 men and women from towns surrounding Salem. Their names had been cried out by tormented young girls as the cause of their pain. All would await trial for the crime of witchcraft punishable by death in 17th century New England. In June of 1692, the Special Court of Oria and Termina sat in Salem to hear the cases of witchcraft. Presided over by Chief Justice William Stroughton, the court was made up of magistrates and jurors. The first to be tried was Bridget Bishop of Salem, who was found guilty and was hanged. 13 women and 5 men from all stations of life followed her to the gallows on 3 successive hanging days before the court was disbanded by Governor William Phipps in October of that year. The Superior Court of Judicature, formed to replace the Witchcraft Court, did not allow spectral evidence. This belief in the power of the accused to use their invisible shapes or specters to torture their victims had sealed the fates of those tried by the court of Oria and Termina. The new court released those awaiting trial and pardoned those awaiting execution. In effect, the Salem witch trials were over. Today, witchcraft has come full circle, and itself considers Satanism to be the dark side of Christianity rather than a branch of Wicca. In fact, this is true because of the character of Satan exists only in the theology of the 3 Abrahamic religions, and Satanism arose as and occupies the role of a rebellious counterpart to Christianity, in which all is permitted and the self is central. What emerged was 2 ways of looking at Satanism. Satan seen as a supernatural fatherly deity, or Satan seen as a symbolic representation of human traits. In the 20th century, new groups emerged such as the Ophite cult, or Cult of the Serpent, and the Church of Satan. Satan suddenly became the honored god of pagan times and not the anti-Christian evildoer. Soon, Wicca referred to wisdom, and it was a kind of gnosis or knowledge. Witchcraft became a route to wisdom and all-knowing, and Christianity was opposed to this because the true knowledge came only from their God. There are many people across time who have claimed to know the truth about real magic. From alchemy to trickery, we have been presented with a bewildering array of fanciful ideas. Evil, crackling witches who created potions to poison their victims, and dark, bloody satanic rituals held in the black of night are all images conjured for us by the books and films. The half-man, half-horned goat is the terrible picture we have of a dark lord of the black magicians. And yet, most of this is propaganda put forward by a fearful church. The truth is that there are many men and women who have stood out from the crowd and been maligned by the media. Eliphas Levi, Paracelsus, Aleister Crowley, Madame Blavatsky, Saint Germain, Dr. John Dee, and more. Sexual orgies, dark satanic rituals, sacrificing babies, and blood offerings are just a selection of the examples brought to light by the press. And yet they neglect the very real essence of magic, the parts that many today would call paranormal. It was into this dark and murky world that the masters of magic peered and brought back with them knowledge unattainable by other means. The word magic is related to imagination. It is conjuring something from what appears to be nothing, a rabbit out of a hat, an idea from within the darkest recesses of the mind. It was once the dark remit of the mage, the magician, the wise wizard. In truth, we all are magicians, constantly imagining, and from those thoughts we create, we become creators. This is why ancient philosophers said that we are all God, for we all speak the word and manifest it into reality. Magic is the belief that the material universe is only a very minor part of all reality, and that, in fact, it includes many other planes of existence and even consciousness. In the same way, we possess consciousness and unconsciousness, both of which have their own concepts of reality. So too the universe mirrors this and more. Also, in the same way that we cannot access the unconscious realm of our own mind, we simply cannot access the other realities of the universe, unless, of course, there is a way. And that is the realm of magic, being able to find ways of accessing other realities and affect our own. One of the other realms or realities of magic is known as the astral light, and believers of this reality say that the cosmic force of the astral light can form or mold physical forms. The force that can do this is said to be human thought, human willpower. The human being existing in the microcosm can, once it understands, affect the macrocosm. The small can affect the large. We can set in motion an action in our own level of reality and cause an effect in the greater reality. All of this can sound quite potty to the mind that is not used to such concepts, and like the hand of a clock, we need to adjust our position a moment at the time in order to understand that time and things change. Understanding this magical ability of the human being takes some effort, and indeed, it has taken men lifetimes to come to terms with or blow away. In essence, man discovers that he is in fact God in almost every sense of the word. To the growing elite and occult brotherhoods, magic is truly powerful. One famous 19th century and early 20th century occultist was Dr. Gerard Encausse, otherwise known as Pappus. He founded the modern group known as the Martinists, based upon an 18th century Martinist order, a kind of New Age Christian sect. He claimed that magic was really scientific, carrying out experiments on powers and energies that were little understood at the time. He stated that magic was dangerous and that three main principles were required in its operation, namely the willpower of the individual, the actual material basis and the actual force upon which the mind or will operates and affects a change in the material. This was a period seeing the rise in scientific thought overpowering religious or spiritual. This force, which science would discover, was known to the Jews as the Odd, the astral light to others, and the magnetic fluid to yet more. It was seen by our ancestors when they took drugs or went through special procedures to open their mind in a very Woodstock way. Witches or special folk such as the shaman of the past could access with realm where they saw the force. It was a natural composite agent, a fluid force that semi-modern witch and magician Eliphaz Levi said would receive the vibrations of the will via meditation. It was a force acted upon by the frequency of thought. Levi stated that it was a force that illuminates the mind, verifies and destroys, separates and coagulates, all depending upon the will of the individual. According to 17th century writer J.B. van Helmont, it was a magical force sent asleep by sin, is latent in man. It can be awakened by God or by the art of the Kabbalah. And what is this force? As Eliphaz Levi again tells us in his History of Magic, it has been said that this agent is a light of life by which animated beings are rendered magnetic, electricity being only a transient perturbation. The practice of that marvelous Kabbalah reposes entirely in the knowledge and use of this agent. Practical magic alone opens the secret temple of nature to that power of the human will which is ever limited but ever progressive. And yet, we can see in the tales of Bram Stoker, the world of his invasive darkness of magic was putting a strain on the uptight Christian ethics prevalent in the West, and many openly fought its influence, just as they had done against true ancient witchcraft. In the Black Mass form in 1924, we find the following statement. Today, when our society is invaded by the eroticism of the Middle Ages sorcery, the words Black Mass have lost their primitive meaning. The mystic element weakening, sadism, and sensualism alone remain, degenerating these last two into vulgar orgy, so-called revival of pagan ceremonies accompanied by lewd scenes, excited by the rhythm of libidinous poetry and the intoxication of oriental perfumes. In short, we are told that the frenzies of the sexual rites associated with the rising of these so-called powerful occult forces was vulgar to the Christian West. It seems nothing had changed in our so-called modern era. We are told that literary groups such as those of the Bloomsbury Set or Black Mass were full of adherents to the occult. They were also joined by people such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Ian Fleming, Bram Stoker, and H.G. Wells. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge and much of scholarly London were infested with the black arts, creating a kind of mass hypnotism. Emerging from these groups, we find such people as Aleister Crowley, creating his own occult groups and influencing a great many writers thereafter. There are several points of discussion in this little snapshot of history. Firstly, we see that many of those influencing the minds of British citizens were in fact foreigners, and thus we have that spiritual invasion spoken of by Bram Stoker in Dracula. Then we have the birth of subsequent revolutions, such as the 60s and 70s hippie drug revolutions. For instance, Crowley being found on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album. We are shown that sexual license and drug-induced frenzies were supposedly leading these people on the downward path to the world of Satan. There is nothing new in any of this, for it has been repeating for millennia. Freemasonry itself, amongst many others, claims descent ultimately from Egypt, where drugs were heavily influential in the spiritual and magical life. Initiates were and still are in some cults subjected to horrifying trials of darkness, fire, water, long fasts leading to visions. Should they survive sane, then they are accepted into the fold. Hallucination was one of the prime methods of Egypt theurgy, using opium, datura, henbane, hashish, cinnamon, and laurel, creating vapors, which brought on the frenzy of the prophets. But we also see that we have two distinct opposites and very little balance. On the one side, we have thoughtful, intelligent people discovering freedom from a Victorian and religious yoke, like children showing off in front of their friends. On the other side, we have the parents, the Christian old school, who are shocked at their youngsters' actions and can accept nothing good in what they see. Our problem is that we have divided nature into compartments that no longer see the whole. We have named everything, and in so doing, we have reduced them down to constituent parts. We have separated them from one another, and this is not reality, but our own created reality. The truth of the existence of all things will and can only be found in realizing the whole and not the parts. As John Ciardi said, "Who could believe an ant in theory, a giraffe in blueprint? 10,000 doctors of what's possible could reason half the jungle out of being." Sir Isaac Newton used a crystal to separate light into the spectrum. He divided the wave and particle stream so that what he saw was the divided parts. He then used another crystal to form them back together again. When all of these colors were formed back as one, the result was pure white light. Purity is found in the whole, undivided nature. Our conscious mind divides, our unconscious mind reunites. Real magic is understanding this and using methods of control to work with it. Nature without the supposed conscious self-awareness of man and his inherent free will does not name and divide. Instead, it forms balance when left alone. It comes back together in accordance with the natural laws of mathematics, inbuilt into all things. By dividing nature, we upset the mathematical purposefulness of it. We divide more than just our minds. We divide ourselves from it. When a crystal is sliced in half and then placed side by side, the two divided parts form back together again in perfection. It is the law. We have forgotten this intuitive process. We are divided by our own free will from the pure white light. But there is a deeper concept here, and one that reveals the mind of the grand architect himself. Quantum physics states that when we observe a particle, we can cause an effect on our own free will. Mathematical equations suggest to us what the majority of particles will do, but every now and then, one or another particle will decide to do something different. This is a kind of chaos theory, as if by naming it we can understand it. The truth is that scientists do not understand the complexity of it all. In the same way, we can mathematically predict what a group of humans will do. But every now and then one of them will do something different, because of its free will and own complexities. How is it that we can say the free will of the human is the explanation for this mathematical conundrum, and yet accuse the particle of chaos? The truth is that the particle is acting according to some kind of free will, and so what has been stated for thousands of years and is now coming into scientific realization is the fact that there is a greater mind at work. That mind is seen in the glorious mathematics derived from the early stages of the Big Bang itself. And so, that mind is the mind of the Creator. It is ultimate free will. This is the thread between the cosmos and the quantum world. This is the unifying concept, the connection missed by division between right and left hemispheres. It is mind, awareness, conscious-minded nature at the heart of it all, born from and of and giving birth to the Big Bang itself. That mind is the universal quantum crystal prism. We can peer into that crystal and see the beautiful colors of the rainbow. But one thing is sure, we will also see ourselves. This is real magic. This is what the science still does not truly grasp. Intuition is inner teaching, and that teaching is derived from an unconscious connection to the universe surrounding us. The understanding of this principle is what the magicians of the past spoke of. The language differs, the meaning remains the same.